Shadows hide secrets within lavish walls. Silent footsteps mask terror. Silk ties choke powerful men. She saw danger hiding behind a driver's tailored jacket. One whisper changed everything. Death waited in a black Maybach. But a quiet maid's warning ripped apart a carefully constructed empire of lies and betrayal. Nora Hayes moved through the sprawling Sands Point estate like a ghost. In a world dictated by ruthless men and their violent ambitions, invisibility was her greatest asset. She had spent the last 8 months polishing baccarat crystal vases, dusting imported mahogany furniture, and ignoring the heavy, threatening conversations that echoed through the grand hallways. She was a maid for the Romano Syndicate, a position she had taken out of sheer desperation to disappear from a past she'd rather forget. Vincent Romano, the newly ascended head of the family, commanded the estate with an icy, terrifying precision. He was a man chiseled from marble and malice, inheriting his empire after his father's sudden, suspicious heart failure. Vincent did not scream. He did not throw tantrums. His anger was a quiet, suffocating force. Those who crossed him rarely lived long enough to regret it. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in October. The Long Island Sound crashed aggressively against the private beach at the edge of the property, mirroring the tense atmosphere inside the mansion. Today was a crucial day. Vincent was scheduled to attend a high-stakes sit-down with the Calabrese faction in a private dining room at Del Frisco's Double Eagle Steakhouse in Manhattan. It was a meeting meant to forge a fragile peace, but everyone in the estate knew it was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Nora was assigned to clean the West Wing study, an assignment she usually dreaded because it placed her dangerously close to Vincent's inner circle. As she quietly wiped down a massive oak bookshelf, her eyes naturally gravitated toward the large bay windows overlooking the circular driveway. Below, David, Vincent's personal driver, and a trusted lieutenant, stood leaning against the armored Mercedes Maybach S680. David had been with the Romanos for over a decade. He was a stoic, imposing figure, usually as immovable and unreadable as a brick wall. But today, something was entirely off. Nora paused, the microfiber cloth still in her hands. She possessed a terrifyingly sharp eye for detail, a survival mechanism honed from years of living on edge. David was pacing. It was a tight, controlled movement, but pacing nonetheless. Every few seconds, he pulled a burner phone from his pocket, stared at the encrypted screen, typed furiously, and shoved it back. He wiped sweat from his brow. The morning air was biting, hovering around 40 degrees. Yet David was perspiring. But it was what David did next that sent a cold spike of adrenaline straight through Nora's chest. The driver reached around to the small of his back, instinctively pressing his hand against the fabric of his dark suit jacket to adjust something heavy. Nora's eyes narrowed. David was a professional. His standard-issue weapon was a Beretta, always carried in a sleek shoulder holster under his left arm to ensure a quick draw from a seated position in a vehicle. He never carried at the small of his back. It was horribly impractical for a driver. Unless, of course, the gun wasn't meant to protect the passenger, but to be drawn on him from behind before he even got into the car. Nora watched as David checked the hidden weapon a second time, his knuckles white, his gaze darting nervously toward the mansion's heavy oak front doors. He was terrified. A man like David only showed fear when he was about to do something irreversibly catastrophic. Footsteps echoed down the marble corridor behind her. Matteo, Vincent's underboss, was barking orders into his phone, his voice laced with profanity. "Tell them we leave in 20. If the Calabrese crew brings more than 3 men, we turn the cars around and the deal is off," Matteo snapped, marching past the study without giving Nora a second glance. Nora kept her head down, scrubbing a spot on the shelf that was already spotless. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was a maid. She was supposed to be blind, deaf, and mute to the business of the Romano family. Speaking out of turn could result in a bullet. Intervening in Mafia affairs was a guaranteed death sentence. Yet, as she looked back out the window at the sweating, trembling driver preparing to assassinate the man who paid her wages, a grim realization settled over her. If Vincent died today, the Romano Empire would fracture. A bloody war would tear through the estate, and the staff, the witnesses, would likely be the first loose ends tied up by whoever orchestrated the hit. Her survival was directly linked to Vincent Romano's heartbeat. She tossed the cleaning cloth into her bucket. She had 20 minutes to change the course of a mafia war. The master suite on the second floor was a cavernous space of suffocating opulence, decorated in deep charcoal and silver. Nora slipped through the heavy mahogany double doors, her arms full of freshly pressed fret linens. Vincent Romano was standing in front of a full-length mirror, his back to her. He was already dressed in a crisp white dress shirt and tailored trousers, but he was cursing softly in rapid-fire Italian. His left shoulder was stiff, a lingering remnant of an assassination attempt 3 months prior that had left a bullet lodged dangerously close to his collarbone. He was attempting to knot a dark, woven Brioni silk tie, but his restricted mobility was making the precise folds impossible. "Damn it," Vincent growled, ripping the silk knot apart and starting over. Nora moved quietly to the massive king-sized bed, stripping the pillowcases with efficient, practiced movements. She kept her eyes averted, but every nerve in her body was electrified. She had to tell him. But how do you tell a notoriously paranoid mafia boss that his most trusted driver is about to execute him? Vincent let out a frustrated sigh, dropping his hands to his sides. He caught Nora's reflection in the mirror. "You," he barked. His voice was a low baritone that commanded immediate obedience. "Come here." Nora froze. She clutched a silk pillowcase to her chest, her breathing shallow. "I don't have all day," Vincent snapped, turning to face her. His dark, calculating eyes locked onto her. He looked exhausted, the weight of a fracturing criminal empire resting heavily on his broad shoulders. "Fix this." "My shoulder is useless today." Nora swallowed hard, nodding once. She dropped the linens and walked across the plush Persian rug. As she stepped into his personal space, she was immediately hit by the scent of him. Tom Ford Oud Wood cologne, expensive espresso, and the cold, metallic underlying scent of danger. He towered over her, radiating a terrifying, kinetic energy. She reached up, her small, trembling fingers taking hold of the heavy silk tie. She didn't look at his face. She kept her eyes fixed firmly on the collar of his shirt. She flipped the wide end over the narrow end, wrapping it with careful precision. "You're shaking," Vincent noted coldly. "Are you afraid of me?" "Everyone is afraid of you, Mr. Romano," Nora replied softly, her voice barely a murmur. Vincent let out a dark, humorless chuckle. "At least you're honest." "Make the knot tighter." Nora adjusted the fabric, sliding the knot up to his throat. She smoothed the collar down. The physical proximity was intoxicating and terrifying. She could feel the steady, rhythmic thumping of his heart beneath the crisp, white cotton of his shirt. He was alive. In 10 minutes, he wouldn't be. She took a deep breath. It was now or never. She kept her hands flat against his chest, leaning in just a fraction of an inch so her voice wouldn't carry beyond the walls of the suite. She looked up, directly into his dark, ruthless eyes. "Your driver has a gun," she whispered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. "It's a non-standard weapon, tucked into the waistband at his lower back. He's checked it 3 times in the last 5 minutes, and his hands are shaking." Vincent's entire body went rigid beneath her touch. His eyes widened a fraction of a millimeter, the only physical tell of his shock. The air in the room instantly dropped 10 degrees. He didn't pull away. He didn't laugh. He stared at her, an intense, terrifying intelligence, calculating 1,000 different scenarios in a split second. "Do not get in that car," Nora finished, dropping her hands and taking a deliberate step back, casting her eyes to the floor once more. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. "David has been with my family for 12 years, Vincent said, his voice dropping to a lethal, quiet register. "If you are lying to me, or if you are mistaken, I will have Matteo drag you into the sound by your hair." "I am not mistaken," Nora replied, keeping her gaze pinned to his expensive leather Oxfords. "He is sweating in 40-degree weather. He is texting frantically on an encrypted phone, and he is carrying a weapon designed for a close-range execution, not for defending a vehicle." Vincent stared at the top of her head for a long moment. A mafia boss survived by trusting no one, but he also survived by listening to his instincts. And his instincts told him the terrified maid standing in front of him had absolutely nothing to gain by inventing this lie, and everything to lose. "Wait here," Vincent commanded. He turned on his heel, grabbing his suit jacket from a nearby armchair, and strode out of the bedroom. Nora collapsed against the edge of the mattress, her legs completely giving out. She pressed her hands over her mouth to stifle a sob. She had just crossed a line from which there was no return. Downstairs, Vincent walked out the front doors, flanked by Matteo and two heavily armed guards. The cold morning air hit his face. He walked down the stone steps toward the idling Maybach. David stood at attention, rushing forward to open the rear passenger door. "Morning, boss. Traffic is clear on the Long Island Expressway. We'll be at Del Frisco's with time to spare," David said, his voice pitching just slightly too high. Vincent stopped 3 feet away from the car. He didn't look at the open door. He looked at David. He noted the sheen of sweat on the man's forehead. He noted the rigid posture. "Change of plans, David," Vincent said casually, slipping his hands into his trouser pockets. "You're not driving today." David blinked, panic flashing violently in his eyes. "Boss? The route is secured. I should be the one to." I said, "You're not driving," Vincent repeated, his voice dropping an octave. He took a step closer. "Turn around." David froze. "Vincent, we don't have time for Matteo." Vincent barked. Before David could react, Matteo and another guard closed the distance, slamming the driver against the side of the armored Maybach. David let out a shout, his hands instinctively dropping toward his lower back. Matteo was faster. He jammed a knee into David's thigh, reaching beneath the driver's tailored jacket. Matteo pulled back, holding a black, unmarked Glock 19. He held it up for Vincent to see. "Chambered and ready," Matteo growled, pressing his own weapon firmly against the base of David's skull. "He was going to put one in the back of your head the second you sat down." Vincent stared at the weapon, a cold fury washing over him. The maid had been perfectly right, every single detail. David had sold him out to the Calabrese family. The peace meeting was a trap, and his own car was meant to be his coffin. "Take him to the basement," Vincent ordered, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Find out who paid him. Then, get rid of him." As the guards dragged a screaming, pleading David away toward the hidden service entrance, Vincent stood alone in the driveway. He looked down at his perfectly tied Brioni silk knot. He slowly looked back up at the second-floor window of his master suite. He couldn't see her through the tinted glass, but he knew she was there. A maid, a ghost who dusted his furniture, had just saved his empire. Vincent pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed his head of security. "Cancel the meeting at Del Frisco's. Send a strike team to the restaurant. The Calabrese crew is planning an ambush. And get someone up to my suite. To secure the room, boss?" The voice on the other end asked. "No," Vincent replied, staring at the window. "To tell the maid she just got a promotion." The heavy oak door to the master suite clicked open, sounding like a gunshot in the dead silence of the room. Nora flinched, her fingers digging into the plush fabric of the armchair she had collapsed into. She hadn't dared to move for the last 40 minutes. The muffled sounds of shouting from the driveway had faded long ago, replaced by the terrifying, suffocating quiet of a mansion bracing for war. Vincent Romano stepped into the room. He had discarded his suit jacket, and the sleeves of his crisp white shirt were rolled up to his elbows. He looked immaculate, entirely unbothered by the fact that he had just ordered an execution in his own driveway. He closed the door behind him and locked it. Nora stood up immediately, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She kept her eyes cast downward, staring at the polished tips of his Italian leather shoes as they crossed the Persian rug toward her. "Sit," Vincent commanded. The word was not a request. It was an absolute directive. Nora sank back into the armchair. Vincent didn't sit. He paced in front of her, his dark eyes analyzing every inch of her trembling frame. For a man who controlled the most lucrative illegal shipping ports on the eastern seaboard, his current focus was entirely consumed by the small, pale woman in a standard gray housekeeper's uniform. "David confessed before he reached the basement," Vincent said, his voice a low, rhythmic baritone that demanded attention. "He was paid $3 million through a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. The money came from Dominic Calabrese. The plan was exactly as you deduced. A bullet to the back of my head the moment the car doors locked. The peace summit at Del Frisco's was a staged diversion. Nora swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. I am glad you are safe, Mr. Romano. Vincent stopped pacing and leaned over her, bracing his hands on the arms of her chair, effectively trapping her. The scent of oud wood and cold, lingering adrenaline washed over her. Who are you? He asked softly, though the menace in his tone was unmistakable. You are not a maid. A maid notices dust on a baseboard. A maid notices a smudge on a baccarat crystal glass. A maid does not notice the weight distribution of a concealed, non-standard firearm on a trained killer, nor does she correctly deduce the psychological tells of an impending assassination. Nora's breath hitched. She had known this interrogation was coming. When you save a monster's life, the monster inevitably demands to know why. My name is Nora Hayes, she whispered, forcing herself to meet his intense gaze. Matteo is running your fingerprints and facial recognition through our databases right now, Vincent countered smoothly. If you are a federal agent or a plant from the Lucchese or Calabrese families, I will find out within the hour. Your only chance to walk out of this room breathing is to tell me the truth before my underboss does. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. I'm not a cop, and I don't know anyone named Lucchese. I swear. Then explained the tactical observation. Nora closed her eyes. The protective walls she had built around her past, crumbling under his scrutiny. Before I was a maid, I lived in Chicago. I worked as a senior risk analyst for Kroll, the corporate investigation firm. My specialty was behavioral profiling and financial forensics. I tracked missing millions for Fortune 500 companies by watching the people who moved the money. Vincent's eyes narrowed slightly, processing the information. A corporate spy, an analyst, she corrected nervously. But 8 months ago, I was assigned to audit a logistics company that was bleeding capital. I dug too deep. I found a massive money laundering operation. The men running it weren't corporate embezzlers. They were the outfit, the Chicago mob. Vincent straightened up slowly. The lead detective on my police contact list, a man named Arthur Pendleton, was on their payroll, Nora said, her voice finally breaking. He warned them. They burned my apartment to the ground. I barely got out. I couldn't go to the feds because I didn't know who else was bought. So, I ran. I bought a fake ID, moved to New York, and took a job where I knew no one would ever look twice at me. A maid in a Long Island mansion. Silence enveloped the room. Vincent stared at her, assessing the raw, unadulterated terror in her eyes. It was a currency he dealt in daily, and he knew a genuine counterfeit from the real thing. She was telling the truth. You hid from the Chicago outfit by cleaning the toilets of the Romano family, Vincent stated, a dark, humorless smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. That is either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. It was invisible, Nora whispered. Until today. A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Boss, Matteo's muffled voice called out. I got the background check. You need to see this. Vincent walked to the door, opening it just enough to block Matteo's view of the room. He took a manila folder from his underboss, exchanging a few hushed words before closing and locking the door again. He flipped open the folder, his eyes scanning the pages. It seems you are exactly who you say you are, Nora, Vincent murmured, tossing the file onto his massive oak desk. He turned back to her. You saved my life today. In my world, a debt of blood is absolute. The Romanos protect their own. I don't want to be involved in your world, Nora pleaded softly. I just want to keep my head down and do my job. Your job as a maid is terminated, Vincent stated coldly. Nora's heart stopped. She stood up, her hands trembling. Please, Mr. Romano, You are moving out of the staff quarters in the basement, Vincent interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. You will occupy the guest suite at the end of the east wing. You will have a guard at your door at all times. The Calabrese family just declared war, and my estate is no longer safe for anyone, especially the woman who ruined their $1 million assassination plot. From now on, you work directly for me. Doing what? Nora asked, completely bewildered. Vincent's gaze turned predatory, a chilling mix of ambition and calculating intellect. You read the room better than men who have carried a badge or a gun for 20 years. You are going to be my shadow, Nora. You are going to watch my capos, my associates, and my enemies. You are going to tell me who is sweating, who is lying, and who is holding a gun behind their back. 3 days later, the Romano estate resembled a military compound. Black SUVs idled at the heavily gated entrance, and armed men patrolled the perimeter of the Sands Point property. The failed hit on Vincent had ruptured the fragile peace in the New York underworld. 2 Calabrese-owned warehouses in Queens had mysterious electrical fires, and a Romano-affiliated union boss was found severely beaten in an alleyway in Brooklyn. Blood was being spilled, quietly but relentlessly. Nora found herself trapped in a gilded cage. The East Wing guest suite was the size of her entire former apartment, boasting panoramic views of the Long Island Sound, a marble soaking tub, and a closet filled with clothes she had never asked for. Vincent had sent a personal shopper from Bergdorf Goodman to the estate. Her drab gray uniforms were replaced with tailored cashmere sweaters, silk blouses, and perfectly cut trousers. She was no longer a ghost, she was an asset, and Vincent treated his assets with terrifying possessiveness. It was Friday evening when the heavy mahogany door to her suite opened. Vincent stood in the doorway, dressed impeccably in a midnight blue tuxedo, a platinum Patek Philippe watch gleaming on his wrist. The sight of him still sent a jolt of primal fear and an undeniable, deeply confusing electric spark through her stomach. "Get dressed," Vincent ordered. He gestured to a garment bag hanging on the door of her closet. "We are going to Manhattan." Nora stood up from the velvet sofa, frowning. "Is it safe for you to leave the estate?" "Safe is an illusion, Nora," he replied smoothly. "Tonight is the annual Metropolitan Waterfront Alliance Gala at the Plaza Hotel. Mayors, senators, and union heads will be there. It is strictly neutral ground. Dominic Calabrese will be in attendance. If I hide in my house, I project weakness. If I show up and look him in the eye, I project power. And why do you need me?" Vincent stepped into the room, closing the distance between them until she had to tilt her head up to maintain eye contact. The sheer physical presence of the man was overwhelming. "Because Dominic will bring his inner circle. I need to know which of his men look nervous and which of my own men look too comfortable around them. You are going to be on my arm, and you are going to tell me exactly what you see." An hour later, Nora stared at herself in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. She wore a floor-length, deep emerald Oscar de la Renta gown that clung to her curves like a second skin. Her hair was swept up in an elegant twist, and a simple but breathtaking diamond pendant, a loan from Vincent's private vault, rested against her collarbone. She looked like she belonged to him. The realization made her breath catch. The ride to Manhattan in the armored Escalade was suffocatingly tense. Matteo sat in the front passenger seat, an assault rifle resting casually across his lap. Vincent sat next to Nora in the back. He didn't speak, but he poured them both a glass of Macallan 25 from the vehicle's hidden console. When he handed her the crystal tumbler, his fingers brushed against hers. The brief contact was searing. "Stay close to me," Vincent murmured, as the SUV pulled up to the iconic entrance of the Plaza Hotel. Paparazzi flashes exploded like lightning storms on the sidewalk. "Smile. Look bored. And keep your eyes open." The grand ballroom of the plaza was a sea of glittering chandeliers, flowing champagne, and dangerous secrets masked by polite society. Nora kept her hand lightly wrapped around Vincent's forearm, feeling the coiled tension in his muscles beneath the tuxedo jacket. Almost immediately, the atmosphere shifted. The sea of wealthy patrons parted as Dominic Calabrese, a silver-haired man with the cold, dead eyes of a shark, approached. He was flanked by 3 massive enforcers. "Vincent," Dominic greeted, a wide, predatory smile stretching across his face. "I wasn't sure you'd make it tonight. Heard you had some vehicle trouble earlier this week." "Nothing my mechanics couldn't handle, Dominic," Vincent replied smoothly, his grip on Nora's arm tightening just a fraction. "Just a minor malfunction. The trash has already been taken to the junkyard." Dominic's smile didn't reach his eyes. His gaze shifted to Nora, assessing her with vulgar curiosity. And who is this stunning creature? A new acquisition? A private consultant, Vincent said coldly, stepping slightly in front of Nora, a physical barrier between her and the rival boss. Enjoy the champagne, Dominic. I hear it's almost as good as the vintage you keep in your queen's warehouses. Pity about the fires. As the two men engaged in a lethal, thinly veiled exchange of threats, Nora went to work. She tuned out the dialogue and focused on the micro-expressions. Dominic's enforcers were rigid, their hands hovering near their jackets. But it was Dominic's second-in-command, a wiry man named Carlo, who caught her attention. Carlo wasn't looking at Vincent. He was looking across the ballroom, making brief, deliberate eye contact with someone standing near the ice sculptures. Nora subtly followed Carlo's line of sight. Her heart plummeted into her stomach. Standing by the bar, nursing a bourbon and looking entirely out of place in a cheap rented tuxedo, was Arthur Pendleton, the corrupt Chicago detective, the man who had burned her apartment and hunted her across state lines. Nora gasped quietly, stepping back and bumping into Vincent's solid frame. All the blood drained from her face, leaving her pale and trembling. Vincent instantly noticed the shift. He cut his conversation with Dominic short, dismissing the older boss with a curt nod. He pulled Nora toward a secluded alcove near the velvet-draped windows. "What is it?" Vincent demanded in a harsh whisper. "Did you spot a weapon?" "Worse," Nora breathed, her voice shaking violently. She pointed a trembling finger toward the bar. The man by the ice sculpture. The one drinking bourbon. Vincent's eyes tracked to the man. "Who is he?" "Arthur Pendleton," Nora whispered, genuine terror paralyzing her vocal cords. "He's the Chicago detective, the one on the outfit's payroll, the one I ran from." Vincent's jaw locked, his mind raced, connecting the invisible dots with terrifying speed. "If Pendleton is here, he's not acting alone," Vincent concluded, his dark eyes snapping back to Nora. "He has no jurisdiction in New York. The only way a corrupt Chicago cop gets into a high society gala full of made men is if someone invited him." "Carlo," Nora said, forcing her analytical mind to override her panic, Dominic's second-in-command. He just exchanged tactical signals with Pendleton. The air between them grew thick with a sudden, horrifying realization. The Calabrese family hadn't just tried to assassinate Vincent. They had reached out to the Chicago outfit to forge an alliance, and in the process, they had discovered exactly who the Romano family's new ghost really was. "They didn't come here tonight to project power," Vincent growled, pulling his phone from his pocket and signaling for Matteo. He looked down at Nora, an unprecedented possessiveness blazing in his dark eyes. "They brought the Chicago outfit here to flush you out. You are the target, Nora." "Matteo." Vincent's voice cut through the ambient classical music of the ballroom like a serrated blade. He didn't shout, but the absolute lethal authority in his tone brought his underboss to his side in less than 3 seconds. Vincent's hand slid from Nora's elbow to the small of her back, gripping her with a desperate, unyielding possessiveness. He pulled her flush against his side. "We have a breach. The Chicago outfit is in the room. Pendleton is by the ice sculpture. Carlo brought him in to flank us." Matteo didn't look at the bar. A seasoned mobster never tipped off his target. Instead, he smoothly unbuttoned his tuxedo jacket, freeing access to the shoulder holster hidden beneath. "Front doors are choked with paparazzi. We take the service corridors through the kitchens to the loading dock. I'll signal the convoy to pivot to the 58th Street alley." "Move," Vincent ordered. He practically carried Nora as they glided away from the velvet curtains, melting into the crowd of oblivious socialites. Nora's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She kept her eyes locked on Pendleton's reflection in the mirrored pillars. The corrupt detective was tossing back the last of his bourbon. He checked his watch, then made deliberate eye contact with Carlo. The hunt had begun. Vincent kicked open an unmarked mahogany door labeled "Staff Only," plunging them into a stark, brightly lit hallway lined with stainless steel. The transition from the opulent, champagne-soaked ballroom to the utilitarian guts of the Plaza Hotel was jarring. "Take the stairs down to the main prep kitchen," Matteo commanded, pulling his customized Sig Sauer. I'm going to pull the fire alarm. It'll flood the lobby with FDNY and panic the guests. Dominic won't risk a bloodbath in front of the mayor. As Mateo sprinted toward a glass-encased alarm panel, Vincent pulled Nora down a narrow, concrete stairwell. The sounds of their rapid footsteps echoed violently. "Vincent!" Nora gasped, her emerald gown catching on the raw concrete. "Pendleton won't care about a fire alarm. The outfit sent him here to finish what they started in Chicago. He's not leaving without me." "He is leaving in a body bag," Vincent growled, his jaw locked in a rigid line of fury. He drew his own weapon, a sleek, suppressed Heckler & Koch USP. "You are mine to protect now, Nora. No one touches you. Do you understand me?" Before she could answer, the heavy fire doors at the bottom of the stairwell burst open. 2 Calabrese enforcers flooded the landing, their weapons already raised. Vincent didn't hesitate. He shoved Nora forcefully against the wall, shielding her body with his own as he raised his arm. 2 muffled, rapid thwips echoed from his suppressed pistol. The first enforcer dropped instantly, a red bloom expanding on his white dress shirt. The second managed to fire a wild shot that shattered the concrete inches from Nora's head before Vincent put a bullet through his collarbone, sending him crashing down the remaining stairs. "Keep moving!" Vincent yelled over the sudden, blaring shriek of the hotel's fire alarm. They burst into the main prep kitchen. It was a massive, cavernous space of gleaming steel counters and hanging copper pots, abruptly abandoned by the catering staff fleeing the alarm. "Well, well, look what the rats dragged in," the voice echoed from the far side of the kitchen. Nora froze. Arthur Pendleton stepped out from behind a row of industrial ovens. He had shed his rented tuxedo jacket, and a heavy Colt Python revolver dangled loosely in his grip. Carlo stood a few feet to his right, aiming a submachine gun directly at Vincent's chest. "Drop it, Romano," Carlo sneered. "Dominic wants the girl. The Chicago boys are paying top dollar for her head. Walk away, and maybe my boss lets you keep your shipping ports." Vincent stood like a statue, his gun leveled at Carlo, completely ignoring Pendleton. "You made a fatal miscalculation, Carlo. You brought a street cop into a mafia war." Nora's mind raced. The risk analyst inside her overrode the sheer terror paralyzing her limbs. She calculated the angles. Vincent was pinned. If he shot Carlo, Pendleton would shoot Vincent. If he shot Pendleton, Carlo would rip them both to shreds with the submachine gun. She looked down. The Calabrese enforcer Vincent had wounded in the stairwell had dropped his weapon, a compact Glock, near the heavy swinging doors. It was 10 feet away. Pendleton laughed, a cruel, grating sound. "Come here, little bird. Let's finish that audit." He raised his revolver, aiming it squarely at Nora's face. Nora didn't cower. She didn't scream. She locked eyes with Vincent for a fraction of a second, her gaze darting to the heavy, suspended rack of cast-iron pans directly above Carlo's head. Vincent's eyes widened slightly in understanding. "Now!" Vincent roared. Vincent lunged left, firing a single round, not at Carlo, but at the thick steel cable supporting the overhead rack. The cable snapped with a violent crack. Hundreds of pounds of cast iron crashed down directly onto Carlo, crushing him to the tiled floor and sending his submachine gun skittering out of reach. Simultaneously, Nora dove across the wet, slippery floor, her silk gown tearing at the seams. Pendleton fired, the deafening roar of the magnum round shattering the nearest glass refrigerator door. He missed. Nora hit the tiles, her hands wrapping around the dropped Glock. She didn't know how to stand in a proper firing stance, but she didn't need to. From the floor, she rolled onto her back, aimed blindly at Pendleton's center mass, and squeezed the trigger 3 times in rapid succession. The recoil bruised her wrist, but the hollow point bullets found their mark. Pendleton staggered backward, his eyes wide in shock as his gun slipped from his fingers. He collapsed against an industrial sink, sliding slowly to the floor, dead before he fully settled. Silence slammed back into the kitchen, save for the distant, muffled wail of the fire alarm. Nora lay on the cold tiles, her chest heaving, the gun still gripped tightly in her shaking hands. Footsteps rushed toward her. Vincent dropped to his knees, his hands frantically checking her face, her shoulders, tracing the frantic pulse at her neck. His tuxedo shirt was smeared with blood, from a grazing shot to his side. But he didn't seem to notice. "Nora," he breathed, his voice raw, completely stripped of its usual icy control. He pried the gun from her hands and tossed it aside, pulling her violently against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, his breathing just as erratic as hers. "I've got you. You're safe." Nora clung to his lapels, burying her face against the solid, warm expanse of his chest. "I killed him," she whispered, the reality of the violence crashing over her. Vincent pulled back, framing her face with his large, blood-stained hands. His dark eyes burned with an intense, fiery devotion that terrified her just as much as it thrilled her. "You survived," he corrected fiercely. "You saved me on Tuesday. You saved us both tonight. You are never wearing a maid's uniform again." He stood up, pulling her to her feet, his arm wrapping securely around her waist as Mateo burst through the service doors to escort them to the alleyway. The ride back to Sands Point was silent, but the air in the armored SUV was thick with a permanent, irreversible shift. Nora Hayes had entered the Romano Empire as a ghost, a terrified woman hiding in plain sight, but as she looked at the ruthless Mafia boss sitting beside her, a man who had just risked his life and his kingdom to protect her, she realized the truth. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was exactly where she belonged. A maid who wiped away dust, learned to wipe away empires. Nora Hayes stepped into the Romano syndicate to hide, but found a dark kingdom waiting for her. Together, she and Vincent turned a fractured syndicate into an untouchable fortress. The shadows that once terrified her became her greatest weapon, proving that true power isn't always held by the man with the gun, but by the woman who sees everything.